Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're talking about the consolidation and maintenance of power, dissemination of propaganda. Now, just as a refresher, for consolidation, this means the action and process of combining several things into a single or more effective or coherent whole. For maintenance, this is the process of maintaining or preserving someone or something. Both of these are all focused on power. How do we bring all that power onto one, and then how do we keep that power onto ourselves? Now, today we are going to be focusing on dissemination of propaganda, which means disseminate. We already know what propaganda is. We went over that when we talked about the methods used to emerge. But what does dissemination mean? What dissemination means, it's the act or fact of spreading something, especially information, widely. It is the massive spread of information. And we've seen propaganda photos, we've seen propaganda posters, we've seen a lot of these things that were focused earlier. But all of that was before Hitler came to power. Now that Hitler's in power, he has special access to other components. And more importantly, it isn't him who has the access, but Joseph Goebbels, the mastermind that we learned about in the role of leaders. Now, for him, we're going to talk about two key examples here: films and press. Because before they came into power, making making pamphlets, posters, pictures, all of that was easy. But now that they have full control of the government with the Enabling Act and the Gleichstellung, they have a more larger control and more access to bigger forms of propaganda. So those are the ones we want to focus on today. So, films. Well, films is an interesting new tool for propaganda. It's a new type of propaganda that didn't exist prior. So when I say that, I don't necessarily mean for Nazi Germany exclusively. I mean in total. Films were not really utilized for propaganda until about the 20s and 30s. So Hitler coming to power in 1933, this is a brand new weapon that the entire world has. Like the first largest propaganda movie by the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, that didn't get come into existence until 1920, right? So this was a whole new realm for them to use new propaganda. Now, the most famous Nazi propagandist was one of the workers of Joseph Goebbels, known as Leni Riefenstahl. Leni Riefenstahl, which is this woman right here. She was a very famous German actress and a very famous German producer and film creator. Now, she loved the Nazi Party. She loved Hitler. She loved and really fell deep into the Nazi Party. And so she was able to make her breakout in producing several films for the Nazi Party. But her first start was a film called Ich Klag, which means you're to blame or your blame. And this film is it's a very interesting story about a woman who is dying of a incurable disease and is suffering, and she goes to all of these different doctors and asks, like, hey, can you do something about this? Can you help me with this? And all of the doctors pretty much ignore her. And her husband, who is also a doctor, finally makes the agreement between him and her to euthanize her, to put her down so she's no longer suffering. This movie is a very interesting, subtle component of propaganda because it was, one, a very popular movie because it was very well written and so on and so forth. But two, when that movie was produced, the Nazi Party and Joseph Goebbels helped plan how to outroll the new policy that they're going to create called the T4 program, or the euthanasia program, where they are going to euthanize specific members of society, like the mentally disabled. So this movie came out as a predecessor, came out as a slow and subtle buildup of why it's okay to sometimes euthanize people, why it's okay to sometimes end people's suffering. So this type of propaganda was new, was subtle, and effective. She then went on to create another one called Der Ewige Jude. Now, this was all about a Jewish enemy taking over and manipulating the system. This movie was a terrible movie. It was not very well received. It was not very explicit. It also came out relatively early in German in Hitler's rise to power, and actually was seen as too aggressive towards the Jewish minorities, too aggressive towards the Jewish populations, and actually hurt the Nazis' attempt at spreading and building up to Nazi and Jewish attacks. But Leni here pretty much saves herself by creating another movie called Jude Sus. Now, Jude Sus is essentially translate to suspicious Jew. And this movie has another story behind it, has a narrative behind it, and has about as big as a budget as her first movie, Ich Klein, and is very well received, is very well promoted, and helps really push what will eventually happen in 1938, called Kristallnacht, and more on that later. But these films, each one, in a way, helped the German party, helped the Nazi party really come in. With Jude Sus, look at the perspective, look at the narrative, look at the propaganda, the movie poster for it. That is a very evil, demonic portrayal versus Ich Klein, right, which is all about promoting the euthanasia program. Now, between these, and as these movies are being made, Leni starts becoming a household name in 1936 as she starts helping with the first film, a documentary all about the Olympics. And if you notice, the Olympics was about Aryan blood being superior over the different nations. And it was a slow and steady build-up to essentially getting the people of Germany, getting the public to start to agree and be persuaded by this propaganda. Now, while this was going on in the films and in cinema, we also had the press. And this is where Goebbels really put a lot of his focus, in the press. So, what Goebbels did was, as part of the Enabling Act and the Gleichschaltung, Goebbels convinced Hitler to pass the Reich Press Law, also known as the Editor's Law, on October 4th, 1933. Now, this law essentially said that anyone of the Jewish minorities, anyone who was a part of a newspaper that didn't belong to the German party or didn't belong to the German government, had to start submitting all of their articles to the Nazi party, had to submit anything to them for it to be approved by the Nazi party and the Nazi government. As we can see in a picture here, with Goebbels actively reviewing a newspaper, and as you can tell with his expression, he's not exactly pleased with that newspaper. Now, because of how much control the Nazi party tried to get over the newspapers, it was slow, subtle, and very quickly. In fact, the growth of their control at the beginning of the press law was 3% of all newspapers in Germany. But by 1944, they controlled 82%. Between those 11 years, the Nazi party effectively controlled everything that the propaganda machine created. Any newspaper articles was either a direct copy, word for word, from a Nazi article that was promoted by them, or it was something that did not fight against the Nazi party. Now, of these, there are two very famous ones we're going to tap into. Der Stromer and Volkliche Beobachter. Now, the first one, Der Stromer, was a Nazi radical newspaper that was produced by a small group of people that promoted death of the Jewish individuals, death of Romani people, and from the beginning of 1933 promoted this extremist thought. But because it was considered a separate part, it was seen more as like InfoWars, or seen more as like a newspaper that no one paid much attention to. It was just kind of like, okay, those are the radicals over there, we're not going to pay attention. Because the Volkischer Beobachter was the official Nazi Party's newspaper. And you're going to see in the next slide the interesting juxtaposition between these two. When we look at the Der Stromer, this is the type of articles they're producing. In 1936, and right here in July 1936, their main article is all about how the evil, mean Jew, who's also a Freemason and a communist, is slowly eating up the German country, slowly eating up Germany and conquering the world. Whereas when we get to the official Nazi one, it's all about honoring the military, honoring the people, honoring the victories of the war, rather than promoting this extremist thought. The fact that both of these newspapers were being produced at the same time and being spread around the same time shows a effective control of, well, this is what we're actually doing while we are doing this. And so you can choose, do you want to know the reality, or do you want to say like, no, there's no way that's actually happening, versus, oh, this is what's happening, this is where my son is, this is where my father is, my cousin who's fighting the war. So the press and the press law really promotes a very interesting attack and spread of propaganda of both the truth and the falsehoods with the films, to slowly get people on board to commit the atrocities that we see within Germany. Now, the final point that I want to make on this is the fact that the editor's law and the press law, both of those, they're the same thing, fall under consolidation of power. But the growth of the press is maintenance of power. And the films by Leni Riefenstahl, all of those are maintenance of power. So when we're looking at these two, we see that press counts as both, but films is exclusively maintenance of power. You definitely want to make sure to have that separated in your notes.